Welcome back, everyone. Thanks again to our friends at New Star for lunch. And I wanted to mention, for those of you who have not been to a number of our shows before, we do about 30 plus events, both here and in Europe, throughout the year, of different types. We have a number of shows like the ones that we're going to be doing at Internet Week in May, like this, single-day shows that focus on, in case of Internet Week, we'll be focused on particular verticals. We'll be talking about a day on programmatic advertising, followed by a day, as I mentioned earlier, about marketing technology, and then two half days on the 19th, one on social video and the emergence of social platforms. We just saw an announcement this week from Facebook about Facebook Live and the ways in which they were generating a new video hub for which they'll actually be paying publishers cash, and also the local mobile dynamic. So if you're going to be in New York or you have friends who are on the other coast, please let them know that we'll be at Internet Week, as we are every year. But we also have a series of summits, which are very different from shows like these. And these are 3-day retreats that we do mainly for marketers in a variety of verticals. We'll be doing our signature search summit coming up in early May. Starting on May 4th, and that's going to be in Key Largo, Florida. And these are retreats where we have about 30 or 40 marketers that we invite as our guests, along with about as many senior agency executives. We cap these 3-day events at only about 110, 120 people. The idea is to maintain a kind of intimate environment where we do morning content and afternoon activities. People really get a chance to know one another. It's a unique environment. We do these like I said, in search, but we also, one of our longest running series is in email that we'll be doing in June. We'll also be doing our first TV Insider Summit in early June. June 8th through the 11th, which will be about particularly programmatic TV and a variety of advanced TV technologies. So if you go online, go to MediaPost.com, you'll see all of these events. If you're interested in coming, of course, you can register online. If you're interested in speaking, you can ping me, because I oversee all of this event content, ping me at the site and we'll talk. When it came to bringing a lot of these threads together that we've been talking about today and talk about the ways, the trends that we've been teasing out and how they'll inform what marketing looks like in 2021. There isn't anyone better to call upon to do this than Alan Chappell, an old friend of MediaPost. He's been in the digital media and marketing field as long as I have, going back to 1996. Unfortunately, for me, Alan doesn't look it. Alan has maintained, looks about the same he did when I first knew him back in the 90s when he was running some of the first research products for Jupiter. Many of you remember Jupiter, and also for DoubleClick. Since then, he's been advising countless publishers and marketing companies, especially on their privacy policies. Alan is a lawyer, a member of the New York Bar, who specializes especially in issues of privacy and data security. Also a singer-songwriter who's dropping, is it your first album that drops? First in a while. First album in a while that's dropping this week. Please welcome an old friend of MediaPost, Alan Chappell.
So, yeah, I'm the outside counsel and chief privacy officer for a dozen or so premium tech companies. But my first gig right out of college, when I was still trying to make it as a musician, was at a small direct marketing company in Stamford, Connecticut. And I remember I was doing sales and marketing for them, and I was so happy when we landed a very large bank to do a couple of projects with them. And so the first thing the bank does is they send us their customer list. Now, all I needed was names and addresses. But that's not how the bank operated back then. They actually sent me names, addresses, telephone numbers, bank account balances, social security numbers, every single data point that they had on their customers. It's an identity theft's dream. And by the way, they send it to me on these magnetic tape pieces. So there's no encryption, no password protection. If that thing fell off the truck and somebody could read it, that person had the very sensitive personal information for hundreds of thousands of people in Fairfield County, Connecticut. Now, I thought to myself, holy smoke, this has got to be illegal. There's no way that this can be legal. And funny story, turns out that until fairly recently, there were no requirements around encrypting data, securing data, only sending the data that a vendor might need. It was just easier for them to send everything and just let the vendors pick out what they needed. And this is sort of a life transitioning moment for me because I thought, you know, there's something wrong with that, and somebody has got to start fixing those types of problems. So you fast forward a couple of years. I lived in India for a while. I tried to make it as a musician there, and if you think it's hard to make money in the music business in the States, you should try doing it in Mumbai. But did that for a little while and then came back to New York, started at law school, and started at a company called Jupiter Research. And so that was my first gig in the digital space. And I remember I was hired in late 1996, and in 1996, Jupiter Research said that there was $71 million in ad spend in the digital space. 71 million. Right now, that's a rounding error. But if you think about 1996, that's really year one of digital media. So when you fast forward to 2021, it's the golden anniversary. It's happy birthday, digital media. And so Steve asked me to make a couple of predictions, and of course my first prediction is, like most 25-year-olds, digital media will have it all figured out by 2021. By the way, I have no idea who that guy is, but if you Google a smug 20-something, this guy comes up. I'm sure he's a very nice person. I don't know how he ended up in the search rankings. But much more likely, we're going to see something like Illumiscape becoming 20,000 different companies as we continue to fragment this industry. And so I wanted to share a couple of predictions, but maybe more importantly, what I think are some trends that are going to become increasingly important in 2021. So the first one is, okay. So the first one is privacy and consumer perception. So I'm going to start by talking about 150 years ago. In the late 19th century, the Eastman Kodak Company had released the first consumer-focused camera. And you think Facebook caused some privacy concerns. You would not believe the level of acrimony that was directed at these cameras. They were prohibited from beaches. There were all kinds of newspaper editorials talking about how these cameras are just going to be absolutely ruin the concept of privacy. So now you fast forward nearly 150 years. Already you're starting to see. I have friends who have the Echo or other things, and they're talking to these things as if they're a friend. They're sharing damn near everything about their lives with these things. So the larger point that I'm trying to make, which is what when it comes to privacy, we are going to continue to see consumer acceptance in things that previously we would have thought as being unthinkable. I think over the next 5 years, you're going to see a tremendous amount of uses of the location graph. You're going to see sensor data incorporated. And this is a little bit of a divergence, but I do want to highlight this because I just saw this today. The Snapchat folks have taken steps to encrypt any data going through their systems. So, and this is sort of an important, so consumers are accepting of this stuff if, two things, if they see value in the utility, and number two is if they think there's a reasonable chance that whatever trust they're placing in that utility is not going to be abused. So I think that by 2021 you'll see ubiquity in listening devices, sensory devices, and I think consumers will absolutely embrace them so long as those things continue to show value. So there's always a lot of discussion when it comes to privacy around the concept of trust. And I don't want to say that, I don't want to go as far as to say that bad privacy practices don't inhibit trust, but sometimes there's a conflation between the concept of trust and privacy. Consumers will let companies into their lives as long as they see value, even if there's an occasional data breach. But I'm not sure privacy is the strongest trust-related issue for our industry. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this, but I am just going to say that to the extent that we have portions of the industry that are geared towards convincing consumers that advertising is actually content, or are entirely focused on the mere fact of how does one increase the clicks to an article regardless of the content of that article, I think that's where a lot of the trust issues lay. And by the way, I can tell you 100% that there are only 17 mind-blowing ways that somebody can eat a potato chip. And actually, BuzzFeed, there's a time and a place for that. We all like wasting time on kind of second and third tier sites. But the issue comes when the traditional media outlets focus more on the salaciousness of getting clicks to the stories and less on the actual content of the stories. So I actually think that privacy will be a lesser component of trust as consumer acceptance grows around what was previously thought of as intrusive behavior. Okay, number 2, opt-in advertising. Now, it's funny that I'm on a panel, is it the next panel, Steve? Well, the panel in about an hour talking a little bit about opt-in advertising. And so it's actually not really a new term. I mean, Seth Godin, back in 97, 98, was talking about opt-in marketing. And I think he's got a point. I think there are certain products and services that a lot of Seth's philosophies work really, really well for. However, I want to tease out, what do we mean by opt-in? Are we suggesting that there's an opt-in for any type of banner ad? Are we suggesting that there's only opt-in for things like emails or SMS messages? Or because that's kind of a core distinction. What do we really mean by opt-in? If we're talking about one needs to offer an opt-in just for the mere collection of an IP address, and to me that sounds a little crazy, except for the fact that that seems to be the prevailing standard that's being proposed in the European Union and in the States by our own Federal Communications Commission. So if we're talking about the mere collection of an IP address, so you need to ask permission before you serve an ad. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about is what's going to drive opt-in. And usually when you say what's driving it, it sort of means legal or regulatory. Outside of the FCC, there does not seem to be a lot of appetite, at least in Congress or the FTC, on requiring a universal opt-in. We're all kind of, when I say we, I say privacy professionals, are all looking at the European Union to see if where their opt-in standard goes. Now, I personally think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of nuance to the opt-in regime that Europe is ultimately trying to impose. But a lot of people are looking at Europe because if Europe goes full opt-in, and we'll have sort of a test case to see exactly how an opt-in advertising world impacts a marketplace. But there's a lot of other places, like places in South America, APAC, who are looking closely at the EU model to determine if they also want to experiment in an affirmative consent standard. But let me ask just a room full of marketers. So I think that an opt-in makes a lot of sense for certain types of brands, but let me ask, what percentage of your customers had opted in prior to buying something from you? Put a different way, if you got a new product or service, how in the world do you get people to know about it except for interrupting them with ads? I'm not sure there's a really good answer there, but I think that in most companies, when they're trying to launch a new product or service, they're going to have to start somewhere. But here's where I get my real issue with affirmative consent. I've called it fool's gold. I've said this in the International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's shiny. It sounds good. It allows privacy professionals to sleep at night because they feel all warm and fuzzy that, well, they're doing something intrusive. Fine, we'll just require a consent. But here's the thing is an affirmative consent standard is actually not good for privacy, and I'll tell you why. I'm sorry, I always like including a slide of Alfred E. Newman. It sort of brightens up the afternoon. But this is sort of how a lot of the privacy professionals react. They want to point to an affirmative consent standard so that they can feel better. But here's my larger point. If you're going to require consent for any data collection, you are creating marketplace incentives to be as intrusive and collect as much data as you possibly can. If you're going to make me ask permission to collect an IP address, I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to collect as much data as I can. There's no incentive for me not to if I've got to ask permission anyway. Trend 3. The assimilation of ad tech and martech. And I had the good fortune of watching Cora Truffaletti's panel an hour or so ago, and I agree with a lot of what they said. I'm going to boil it down into what I think is a little bit of simpler terms. When you look at ad tech and you look at martech, I actually think this diagram is wrong because the overlap between the two is much, much more significant than this chart would show. I don't know at this point how to differentiate Marketo from MediaMath. They do a whole bunch of the same things. But really, when at its core principle, the distinction between MarTech and ad tech today is personally identifiable information. Ad tech companies for the last 15 years, if you ask any ad tech CEO what their stance on privacy is, I promise you the first words out of their mouth will be, well, we don't touch PII, we don't collect PII, we don't have anything to do with PII, we never ever touch PII. That's our privacy promise to you. And what I'm starting to see in the marketplace is that there are actually marketplace incentives for ad tech companies to start collecting PII. But that's right now the core distinction between ad tech and MarTech. MarTech is allowed to collect people's email addresses in a CRM fashion and use that however they choose. The ad tech companies, and I won't bore you with the historical details of going into DoubleClick Abacus and some of the FTC consent decrees from 1999 and 2000, but the point is that over the last 15 years, ad tech companies have just stayed away from PII, and I think that's going to change. And when it does, by 2021, I think ad tech and marketing tech are going to be virtually indistinguishable. I have another point here. I think that email is going to become less relevant as a message deployment mechanism and much, much more relevant as a state maintenance mechanism. I'm going to explain what I mean around trend number 4. There is a battle going on over state maintenance. Corey said it really well. He said it all comes down to identity. Whoever is able to maintain identity is going to be the one who wins. The New Star presentation basically said the same thing. So let me illustrate what I mean here. The Under Armour folks, they want to collect information from a whole bunch of devices, some of which are Internet of Things enabled, wearables, some of which are computers. There's probably a mobile device in there somewhere. And they know that if they're able to collect this information, you're going to get much, much more robust profiles on who your customer is. To the 2 panels ago, there was a really good point. You want to understand the why, not the what. Well, when you get this level of granularity, I'm not saying you're going to understand the why, but you got a shot at understanding the why. But you have no shot at understanding the why unless you have this type of information. Unless you've got something that enables you to collect data across multiple silos. Okay, well that begs the question, what does one use to collect data across multiple silos? And there's really 2 kind of broad-based approaches. There's the pseudonymous and there's personally identifiable. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. But pseudonymous, an IP address is what they call pseudonymous. A cookie ID is pseudonymous. Apple's IDFA is pseudonymous, and that's sort of the example I'm going to use here. When you think about an IDFA, and anybody in the mobile space, that is the backbone of your advertising and attribution program. It's a super effective ID. It's absolutely wonderful. The mobile space would not be as robust without it. But there's one thing. The IDFA is the property of Apple. They are able to impose how they think that the ID can be used. And so they are able to create rules that say, well, you can't use this ID to measure attribution on another channel. That's actually not Apple, that's Google, that's the Android ID. You can't merge this ID with personally identifiable information. And who's to say that that rule set isn't going to become more stringent over time for all kinds of privacy-related reasons, but also for some business reasons, one of which is that the ones who own the mobile identifier have their own competing businesses that you're sort of building yours around. So bringing it back to the example of Under Armour, if Under Armour is looking to connect all this data, number one, it is almost impossible in a non-probabilistic way to link all of these silos. All due respect to the folks at Neustar, they do a fantastic job of this, but you're just guessing that all these devices are combined if you're pulling it from myriad databases, silos, trying to use IP address as a proxy, trying to use a couple of different mobile identifiers. The only way to link all of these devices together so that you can understand the efficacy of the media spend is to use personally identifiable information. And so getting back to my previous point, let's see if I can do this quickly without. By 2021, email is going to be less important as a deployment mechanism, but email is going to be absolutely critical for maintaining state across multiple, the omni-channel marketing universe. Okay, here's trend number 5, and this is local storage and processing of data. And on the one hand, this is sort of one of those privacy wonk issues, but there's a direct and long-term business consequence to this, and so, and I think this is going to become a much, much larger issue in the next 5 years. So we'll start with everybody's familiar with the larger goal of a tariff, right? I mean, the idea that you raise a tariff to prevent other nations from exporting goods into your nation. And one of the, I'm oversimplifying here, but one of the overarching goals of that is to protect your workforce. So if you buy into the notion, which I think everybody in this today has mentioned at some point, that data is the currency that drives the digital economy, there are initiatives in a number of places that are requiring local storage of data, not the least of which, well, here, let me, well, first let's start here. The European Union is making it more and more difficult to transfer the data, personal data of its citizenry into the US and into really just about anywhere else. Now, some of that is based upon privacy concerns, and I don't mean to sound as cynical as I do, but when you have politicians, particularly in Germany, saying, well, you know, part of this is, you know, we have politicians in Germany saying, well, we don't want, you know, Facebook and Google have the advantage here, and the only thing that we can do to even the playing field is to require them to store data within our shores. Because when you store data within your shores, what you do is you at least from a data processing and data science standpoint, you create a workforce, or you enhance the current workforce in your own existing country. Because if you can't take data outside of the European Union to process, to manipulate, to leverage, you're sort of de facto saying that you need people located in Europe, a European workforce to do that. And that's what's driving a lot of this home storage. So it's actually not just the European Union. You're seeing Russia, and I don't know how much folks in this room are paying attention to this, but you know, the Russians have gone after Twitter and Facebook and a couple of other digital companies around home storage. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why they want to do that in Russia and China, but one of them is clearly to ensure that ensure job growth in the digital world and to, what I would say is, re-level the current playing field. And so when you fast forward to 2021, what I see is the home storage of data is going to become a larger and larger issue, and I think that's going to significantly impact the current U.S. digital trade balance. And that's it. I'll take some questions.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks very much. Any questions for Alan? Yep.
So a number of years ago, I helped M&M Mars launch a global initiative around the world, 27 different countries. And the reason given for why we couldn't port PII across country boundaries is because the rules governing that PII change from one country to another. So the concern was, specifically from the EU, if we give the US PII, you guys may not manage it properly, and you may wind up giving somebody a disk with a bunch of information on it that can now ruin our, the credit histories and et cetera of our population, and we never should have given it to you in the first place. So that was kind of the reason given versus the whole jobs argument. And I'm just wondering, does that reason still exist that you're seeing, or do you really think it really is just about jobs?
No, I do think that, so it's a great question. I do think that there's long-standing concerns, legitimate concerns around privacy in the EU. I will say, though, if one of the reasons that they struck down the trade agreement between the US and the EU, the Safe Harbor Data Transfer Agreement, was because of the NSA, the national security apparatus within the US, and the fear of them continuing to spy on EU citizens. And that's, I don't think you can deny that that's a legitimate concern. However, the Europeans, in the same breath, have granted what they call an adequacy distinction, in order of saying that these other countries have good sound privacy practices in those countries. It's not a long list, but it does happen to include Israel and South Africa, who are two countries that also have sort of a bolstered national security apparatus. And so I think some of this is about privacy, but I think that we'd be fooling ourselves if we think this isn't at least partially about leveling the playing field.
I've got a quick question. As far as everything you took us through was very sort of insightful, but what are your thoughts around how this is all going to shake out? And I don't know if you have a 2021 prediction as far as what it'll look like in 5 years' time?
Well, you have to define it, but do you want to? Okay. I think what is most likely to happen is that there will be a requirement of opt-in that will look like the opt-in that we all engage in every single time we re-update the software on our machine. I think it's going to be because I don't think that, and that'll allow certain regulators and privacy professionals to sleep better at night, but I don't think that that meets anybody's definition of informed consent. And one of the challenges is there are just too many things to make consent decisions around today, and there will be even more going forward. And so, I actually think that you're going to see an opt-in, but it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a very routine click-through. That's certainly what the carrier is going to do in response to the FCC.
Yeah, that was sort of piggybacking off of that question. Who are we going to opt in to cover a lot of what we're talking about? Because we're talking about an Internet of Things, like you used the Under Armour example. Well, they're creating their own little mini ecosystem where you can opt in with them. They have the trust relationship. It relates to a lot of different devices. But when we start talking about the smart home or a lot of other smart devices interconnected, they're not going to be a single manufacturer. So where and with whom will we opt in to make, to share that data across all these different devices?
I think we're back to you're opting into us and our trusted partners, honestly. But I think, so there's been a lot of focus over the last 15 years on this concept of behavioral advertising. And I actually think that is becoming a smaller and smaller component to the larger advertising mix. I mean, we've got first-party data, you've got inferred data from a whole bunch of different sources. Most of the concerns that have been generated from within the industry around privacy were much more intellectual property focused and much less focused on actual privacy. And so to answer your question, I think that the Oracles of the world and the Salesforces of the world will be able to power and say, okay, Hewlett-Packard, who are your trusted partners? And because ultimately, at the end of the day, your relationship is going to be with Hewlett-Packard or with Best Buy or with Amazon or.
So we'll be opting in to PII in the same way we've been opting in already to anonymized data?
I think so. Yeah, and it's sort of unfortunate. I think there's a huge law of unintended consequences going on here where many regulators, US included, want to say that, do not want to make the distinction between pseudonymous data and personally identifiable data. For one thing, you sort of reduce the incentives in the marketplace to de-identify, to anonymize. I think there was one more question over there, if there wasn't one here.
Do we have another? Raise your hand high so I can see it. Over here, yep.
So let's say that something happens before 2021 and the US government gets religion and acts more like the EU in terms of protecting people's privacy and identity. Do you think that would have a negative material impact on marketing in this country?
Yes.
And why do you say that?
I think it would have a short-term negative effect because, number one, it'll favor the incumbents. So that most of the innovation in advertising has come from very small companies. Now, I would also, it's fair to say that a lot of the problems and mischief has also come from some of those same companies. But over the long term, innovation in this space has come from those smaller companies. So if you start to require an affirmative consent standard, all that means is that AT&T is now in charge. That means that the brands are even more in charge. And they're just going to gerrymander the rule set in a way that suit their own purposes. And I think over the long term, that's not great for innovation.
You had mentioned before, though, that affirmative consent is simply inviting companies to ask for even more or to use even more.
Right.
Is that a positive or a negative?
It's a huge negative. I mean, it's wonderful. So I'm of two minds here because my marketing side says, well, that's great. We've got more data. We can now tie together all these disparate silos to gain more and more valuable insights on this type of consumer. That's a wonderful thing. But by collecting more data, you create this dystopian universe where, when I was growing up, my fear of privacy was informed by Big Brother, by 1984. And so, and the definition of that, in my view, is a persistent database of personally identifiable information that lasts in perpetuity. So I actually don't think that's going to be long-term good for privacy.
Alan Chappell, thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve.
And Alan's going to be back with our final panel of the day talking about the opt-in phenomenon. Let me ask Brian and his panel to come up. For the 25 years of digital media, we've been watching the various ways in which major media companies have watched their audiences fragment, watch money flow, especially to some of the major data and content holders and aggregators online. It's now sort of become a more chronic issue of what are the real business models that will make for sustainable quality content over the next 4 or 5 years? We want to thank Brian Botker, who is the founder of Estate 4. Had been a panelist, is now going to take the role of panelist and moderator. Our good friend Susan Mernett came down ill yesterday and can't even speak today. So we wish Susan well over the video stream and welcome Brian. Brian has been with us many times before. He has worked in content development for brands like Disney, Amex, Google, and AARP. Himself a former publisher in journalism, so he brings to this some of the priorities and concerns of the traditional media company. Please welcome Brian and his panel.
Thank you. We were joking around a little bit that the panel is kind of like how people view the journalism field, that we're dropping like flies, but there's a few of us strong ones left, so it's kind of a metaphor for what we got going on. So we've talked a little bit today about putting the customer first and data analysis and whatnot, so I'd like to put you guys first for a second, and it seems like people probably fit into the category of either client side, agency side, tech vendor, or publisher. So curious, how many people here are client side? Nobody. How many here are agency side? Okay, tech vendor side? And publishers? MediaPost folks? Okay, cool. And just to sort of set the framework, it's easy to talk about publishing and journalism in a very broad stroke, but we're gonna focus on that idea of the fourth estate. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term, but it actually goes all the way back to 1787, the British Parliament, of the journalism side there, actually being that fourth branch of British Parliament and holding them accountable. And we've sort of taken that in the United States as well, as calling journalism the fourth estate as that fourth branch of government to hold government accountable, and generally kind of do that in-depth investigative reporting as well. So that's where we'll kind of focus our energies on this topic here, is talking about that and those alternative models. So that being framed up, let everyone kind of give their background. And
I guess I'm next. I'm John Rockwell from the San Francisco Chronicle. So Susan told me yesterday I was the sole newspaper person up here, so now I'm afraid. But I head up circulation at the Chronicle, and despite predictions, otherwise we're actually doing okay. So we're happy about that. So.
I'm Evan Hansen. I'm a senior editor at Medium, which is a new platform for publishing, and came up out of newspapers and been in the news side of things for most of my career. I ran Wired.com for many years and jumped to Medium about 3 years ago, and got some big announcements this week about monetization and how to create sustainable business models for publishers.
My name's Andy Weedland. I've been in the digital space for about 17 years. My last full-time job was last year. I was Chief Revenue Officer at BuzzFeed. And before that, I was at Huffington Post. And now I'm an executive in residence at Andreessen, and I'm advising a bunch of new startups like Mike and Slate and Now This News and Aussie. So bit of a news hound, love the space. But it's not without its challenges.
And I have an agency that's a messaging and content marketing agency. One of the things that I'm looking to do is building a product right now where connecting brands with journalists for a 3 to 6 month stint where they basically fund it. We're calling it benefactor journalism, where the brands can fund that journalism to do in-depth reporting for a particular topic of interest for that brand's audience, but then the brand stays out of the editorial process. And then my agency or other agencies that work with the brand can take some of that source material and create shareable content that the brand actually uses on their marketing channels and things like that. So, so that's kind of like my play in the game right now and all of that. So I guess getting to the main overall topic, is it hurting? You know, do we need new revenue models? Do we need new approaches to how we do investigative or in-depth reporting? And is there a distinction between investigative and in-depth reporting in all that?
I will say that we absolutely need new revenue models. Traditional media, of which I'm part, was for 50 years was very focused on driving volume and ad revenue, and then around 2000, all the senior management noticed as a group that they occasionally made a few dollars off their actual subscribers and readers and viewers. I don't know that traditional media have done a really good job of being smart about monetizing their audiences, but I think we're slowly getting there, so
Well,
very slowly.
I mean, I think we've seen like a certain set of digital companies really be successful at finding ways to make money. There's no lack of new brands that have come up in the last 5 to 10 years that are all remarkably successful. They've got big valuations. And I think what we're really talking about when we talk about the crisis of media right now is legacy publishers with a lot of investment in old style manufacturing of paper products and shipping that product, with old workforce issues around unionization. It's a manufacturing business that was also a media business. And those companies are in real trouble. Their markets used to be defended by geography. It was really hard to produce a competing product and ship it into somebody else's marketplace. So you had a really sort of a monopolistic business. And that is not a very competitive place to be. It generates a lot of bad habits of thinking and complacency. And I think that the news industry has had to wake up some very dormant muscles that did not exist for many, many years. They didn't have to exist. And now, whenever you publish anything, you're competing against the entire body of work of the entire population of the world that's published online. And that's a really tough thing to do. People got to figure it out. I think people who are from older, sleepier world are having a much harder time making that transition over. But we have a lot of very innovative thinking that's happening, and a lot of people building brand new businesses and having no problems at all.
Yeah, I think that it's tough to be in the newspaper business. It's great to be in the news business. And like, I'm old, I like newspapers, but to me it just strikes me as like the most gluttonous thing where, like, print out every single story that might be of interest to me, print it out on paper, and then hand deliver it to my house. It's just such an awesome luxury, especially with a coffee and a cigarette. I mean, like, there's nothing better. But the way that consumers read and consume and share and engage with news is just different. And so the Chronicle's making the changes. I love the paper, but you guys are, I would say, more in the news business than the newspaper business at this stage.
We wouldn't necessarily disagree. The question I have, and I'm the guy who has to sell the subscriptions, so is, from our standpoint, the traditional customer that we have, which surprisingly they haven't all died yet, so we take that as a good sign. They are used to, their perception of the value around that newspaper is still really strong. And if I can, we feel like we still got we have some ability to manage that customer base and still drive a lot of revenue out of it for a few weeks more.
But are you guys shrinking your news team as you go here, or are you guys growing it?
We're growing it. We just added an investigative team this year. We are premiering, probably the first for a newspaper in the United States. We did a full-length documentary film about long-term survivors of AIDS. We're premiering it Friday night. We're sold out. You can't get a ticket. And we're very excited about that. We've gotten a huge amount of traction off of that, and we think that that's the kind of journalism that will set us apart, certainly in the Bay Area for some things, and where we feel like we're getting some uplift with that type of journalism. We're seeing some uplift in retention and acquisition. So we feel excited about it.
That's really interesting, and particularly for me, that really speaks back to some of the legacy of the really awesome reporting that was done back in the days of Randy Schultz, and sort of almost the kind of reporting that you don't really see that often anymore.
And I think that's the interesting thing to me is the layered in-depth. Like, I actually try to stay away from the term investigative reporting because I feel like to brands and to agencies, like, that's scary, right? Like, they don't want to touch anything near investigative because it's volatile. But like in-depth layered reporting, there's a lot of freaking content out there. Like, there's a lot of stuff for people to read, but there's not a lot of layered content. There's not a lot of multi-sided content out there. And finding those distribution platforms for it, to me, that's what I think is the need that's out there, like around that?
Yeah, I think there's this implied connotation that if big established news organizations that have been around for 150 years go away, there won't be investigative or whatever the term you use, like great reporting. And I just don't think that's true. I think that a lot of times, like the established news organizations were asleep at the wheel when the stories of our time broke. Like I think about 2003 with the Iraq War, and you have all these journalists, and they're embedded, and they're on tanks, and they're rah-rah U.S. government. Where are the WMDs? Where was the Wall Street Journal during the Big Short, 2008? You know, the more recent stories about VW and diesel engines and the Panama Papers, these weren't broken by large, established, respected organizations. These were broken by, you know, upstart journalists or new news companies or citizen journalism. So obviously we want the fourth estate. We need a thriving news reporting organization, but I don't think it necessarily has to be, you know, the CBS Nightly News or ABC News. I think it could be done by smaller companies with aggressive journalists.
I think you're right in some regards. I think there's like a national, international, big stories that draw all of the attention from these new news organizations. Places that are not tied to a geographical location have a much tougher task trying to justify reporting into, say, state houses. There's a huge gap in terms of the news gathering capacity of our country when it comes to some of the most important legislative bodies out there. And nobody's really rushing in. BuzzFeed is not rushing to cover the Mississippi state legislature. So I think figuring out ways to fill that vacuum is going to be important. There's this gigantic sucking sound of pulling all of the news value, all of the news talent to major metro areas, particularly New York City. I think 35% of all news jobs in the United States have been posted in New York City this year.
Probably the least effective place for all those people to be.
It could well be. So I think trying to figure out how do you find ways to fill the gap. I was actually talking to Evan Smith, who's the editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, which is a new nonprofit, new-ish. It's about 6-7 years old. But he started that publication, former editor-in-chief of the Texas Monthly Magazine. And he started that paper because specifically the 6 or 7 regional papers of the state of Texas were not covering State House effectively, in his opinion. And he created basically the equivalent of a newswire. He now has 11 reporters covering full-time the Texas state legislature. They were present when, started the filibuster. It was a couple years back. I'm forgetting the details of that, but it was a big deal. They were one of the only news organizations that were present to cover that. So there is a big giant gap there. Nonprofit is probably going to be our best bet to try to fill some of that. And Texas Tribune is funded by foundations and wealthy individual donors.
So we got mainly a bunch of agencies here. So talking about the idea of brand as publisher, right? Like that's a term that's thrown around a lot. I think it's interesting to think a little bit about Netflix as an example, and you'd mentioned this as well from a subscription standpoint, but I think from a content standpoint it's interesting as well because they started off distributing other people's content and now they're developing their own. And now things like Amazon and Netflix are winning Golden Globes and Emmys. And I'm curious your guys' perspective on, does it have to be news organizations? Does it have to be, or sites, you know, whatever you want to call it, like news entities doing it? Or is there a role for brands in their need for content to help fill some of the holes in some of that research? Because I think it really comes down to research, right? Like the time and the energy to get the research done for more in-depth investigative pieces.
I think, well, I think two things can be opposite and equally true. And I think that brands as publishers is a hard trend. And I think that the need for funding investigative journalism or research is important. I don't think those things need to line up. I can tell you that I think brands as publishers is happening. I think that brands realize that advertising effectiveness in the old ways in terms of 30-second commercials or 30-second pre-rolls or banners doesn't work. And if you have a strong brand with something to say and you want to engage your community, the better way to do it is by creating content that people will actually like and share. So I think that's a new business model that Huffington Post and BuzzFeed pioneered, and I think that's happening across the board. Your suggestion that brands fund news organizations, I'm not so sure if that's the way to go, because it sort of implies, okay, I'll fund this, but you can't investigate me. And I think that's kind of a scary proposition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the idea of trust is paramount, right? Like when we're talking about these things and that fourth estate kind of function, yeah, trust is huge. So, I mean, to me, part of that vision of it is you look at soccer, like love to watch soccer, and you get to watch the entire game without interruption because there's a sponsor logo up in the top right. And in that, the brand is able to fill a role to the audience of saying, I want to help make this content possible for you because I know it's important to you, and it creates a leadership position for me. I kind of believe that there's an opportunity there for brands to fulfill that same role from a news perspective of helping be a sponsor of, in effect, a newsroom or a news person to help generate content, as long as there's that wall that's, like anyone who's been in journalism, I mean, we've all been in journalism in some respect, you know there's that wall there that's like this religious wall of you do not do editorial with advertising, and it's like any reporter's gonna like follow that wall to a T, you know?
Well, I mean, this is you break eggs to make an omelet, right? I mean, so in the advertising-supported world news, you're always having engagement with your brands about what's appropriate. If you think this doesn't happen, you're crazy. Brands are constantly trying to meddle.
Sure.
As editor-in-chief of Wired, I spent like a big chunk of my time working with our brands and trying to manage relationships. And let me tell you, if you had a seven-figure deal with an IBM or something like that, and they saw content that they didn't like, you're going to get a phone call. They don't just sit there and take it. So brands are highly, highly engaged in this stuff, and they're pushing the line more and more. And the leverage goes more and more to the brands versus the news organizations. I remember back when I was at CNETnews.com, we had a confrontation with Real Networks. And we had broken a story about some of their products, and we ran that. We had it was a legitimate scoop. And the CEO of the company, a guy named Rob Glazer, who's an intimidating character, came out of Microsoft, screaming at us. He's going to yank all his advertising if we don't pull the story. And our CEO stood up for us. He said, "No, go ahead, take your money. We won't go there." I think finding management and leaders in news organizations that have the balls to do that these days when money is so scarce, it's harder and harder to find, and people are pushing the line and getting a lot more fudgy about what's allowed and what's not allowed. So I think that's is there an alternative? I'm not so sure, and you can have good relationships that work for you. My biggest fear is less the direct censorship of news and more the sin of omission, that as somebody who's been given a large amount of money from a sponsor, that you are going to self-guide into stories that are less controversial to that sponsor. You're going to instinctually say that, well, do we really want to do that? Do we want to jeopardize our money? There's these 5 other great stories that we can do instead, so let's leave that one alone.
So if you're getting all your money from soda manufacturers, Coca-Cola, you're never going to report on the San Francisco soda tax increase, that's the basic theory.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it maps like one-to-one like
right.
that. I think it's a little bit more of a gray zone, and the influence is sort of a degree removed. It's not like they're actually on your case telling you pull. It's pretty rare that somebody comes up to you and says, pull that story.
Right.
But it's more of this general sense that, I don't want to piss these people off. I'm just going to stay away from a certain style of coverage.
But to some degree, that chilling effect, whatever's been going on for a long time, right, is just now being accelerated to some degree, right?
Well, yeah, I think the leverage of the publishers is diminished. I think because of the financial realities of running a publishing business today, you're much less likely to turn down money. It's just not good business. So I think people are going to try to find ways to accommodate and ways to work with advertisers in a way. And if you talk to people at new media companies, they will tell you flat out, you cannot apply the old rules of publishing to the need to think creatively, you need to think innovatively, you need to think outside the box. So a lot of the rules of engagement that you might have learned back in J school in the 80s are really up for grabs again. People are rethinking it, and they're trying to understand how can we come up with a new set of principles that both allow readers to feel the trust that they need in the news source, and we get to do commerce that's going to be able to support and pay for all this work.
Yeah,
So-
I think that's a hard trend, and I no longer work at BuzzFeed, but I can tell you that when we were trying to find a model that would work, we overemphasized the church and state situation, and we made it a point not to run banners and not to have any edit content funded or adjacent to any advertising. And what that allowed us to do is the advertisers can create branded content and we'll promote it as a story on our site, but there is no way that they're underwriting or funding or subsidizing or at all influencing edit. And so it was a crazy sort of draconian way to do it, but it made it a lot clearer. And you're absolutely right. We'd piss off clients, they'd call, they'd complain, but we held the line. And at the final analysis, when you start like playing around the edges and you start getting a little loosey-goosey with church state, like you lose credibility and you lose that charisma that advertisers want to be with. And so I think it's a short-term situation where a lot of people will take the short-term dollars and think it's the right decision, but I think long-term, church and state has to be maintained.
Yeah, I mean, without trust, it's like, that's the difference, right? That's the difference between anyone writing, doing research and writing a story and someone with that trust. I mean, people go to the story more, it'll have more credence if it has the trust associated with it, right? So we talked a little bit about the revenue models. What are each of your favorite models, or which ones do you think have the most, opportunity that maybe are, let's call it alternative or different from the standard models?
I'll go for us at the Chronicle. And again, I'm on the circulation side of the world, so I'm very partial to our ability to sell the content and to drive premium subscribers. We also believe that as we expand the footprint of the types of experiences that we offer to customers, so we're getting huge lifts in retention and acquisition for customers when we pair their experience of getting the newspaper online and every tablet and all those devices, plus an event where they get to meet the newsroom team, as an example. And so we have a membership program, which sounds very grand. It's really just me and one other person trying to figure this stuff out. And we've gotten a lot of traction, and we have metrics that we feel are positive when we take what we do naturally and give the local community more access to the people that are creating. We do an actual tour. We've done it 5 times now of our printing plant. Now I got to tell you, I work at the newspaper, and there's nothing duller than going to the printing plant. But we had a couple hundred subscribers show up. Fed them a cube of cheese and a glass of bad wine, and voila, they were happy as can be. They were all still subscribers. So to me, that's important. And I think those kind of models we've got to keep playing with. So feel free to come on a newsroom tour when you subscribe.
For the crappy wine and the cube of cheese.
Yeah, you're right. You get the cube of cheese.
Well, since we're plugging our own products here, so we're playing at Medium with a couple of new models. One is native advertising and the notion of publisher as a creative agency. So we launched this week a program that allows a very small group of select publishers on our platform to participate in a new kind of ad network. We are producing inventory, which is in the form of a headline that gets inserted at the bottom of our participating publishers' pages, which promotes a brand or sponsorship advertisement. The advertisement is in the form of an article that looks and quacks like any kind of Medium story does. Those articles are being produced with our assistance, so we can maintain a certain kind of quality control over those. And we're also offering the opportunity for our publishers to participate as creative agencies. So they can work with a sponsor to produce a piece of original creative content, which would then be broadcast through our network through this distribution pipe that we've just created. So we feel like there's both an ability for publishers to make money on distribution, but also in terms of assisting brands and with storytelling, and to cast a story with the voice and the kind of creative point of view that editorial teams are really good at and brands tend to not be so good at. So that's one thing. We also feel very strongly about membership and people having the ability to subscribe to publications that they believe in. You see this, there's a great deal of affinity payment that happens where people are willing to cough up money even if the value exchange is simply, it's a donation really. They're not getting anything extra. It's just they're saying, I want to support this publication. And we see this all over the place, particularly among small boutique publishers that have an ability to create a really strong personal brand appeal to their audience. The relationship feels like people have opted into that editor, that writer, that personality. Those people are doing a tremendous job at driving a lot of subscription revenue. And my favorites in this regard would be a site called Wait But Why. They do incredibly long form features very occasionally. It's very spotty, but whenever they do weigh in on something, it's massive. This guy did a 4-part interview with Elon Musk about everything Elon Musk is working on, from the Tesla all the way to his private space program and all of that stuff. Amazing, amazing deep stuff. He's making $10,000 a month on a site called Patreon from fans who are just voluntarily coughing up money.
That's interesting. He's using Patreon for that?
Patreon.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Which started off as a music funding
Started off
site,
as
right?
music, but it now funds cartoonists. It funds a lot. Susie Cagle is a cartoonist that used to work on Medium and is maybe coming back. She makes a lot of money at it, and a bunch of other people too. So there's a lot of, I think the idea that people won't pay for content, that notion is actually, it's not true. People will pay. It's just you need to find the right appeal, the right approach, and people will start to pay. And people even focus on very specific projects. So there's a really interesting example where the publisher of, it's a tech policy publication down in the Valley, and I'm spacing on the name of it right now, but they decided that the coverage of the FBI-Apple confrontation over encryption was just really badly done. The press didn't get the technology, they didn't understand the policy issues deeply enough, and there was just not good reporting done around that topic. So they put out an appeal to their readers, and they said, we want to hire people to really go deep on this topic. They raised $22,000 in a Kickstarter in 3 days. So there is, I think, a pent-up, or there's a willingness among readers to pay for this. It's not at all a slam dunk. It's hard to get the right message. It's hard to find the right thing and make that click. But there is definitely a willingness for people to pay, and I think finding and building better tools for people to express that and make those connections and those transactions as seamless and frictionless as possible is going to be a big part of what's going to fund independent media going forward.
Well, I don't no longer have a full-time job at any of the 6 news startups I work at, and so I don't have a horse in the race or a product to pimp, but I am looking at sort of hard trends and seeing where the business is going, and I think that if you can charge for content, it's a wonderful thing. I think it's often very hard. When I worked with Ariane Huffington, she would say that people don't pay for content unless it's like really arcane financial information or really weird porn, and she's probably right. I think that banners are death, and I think that the reason that ad blocking has become it's a cultural imperative because I think the ad promise, the ad contract has been broken. I think that is a hard trend, so I don't think you're going to monetize your way by banners. I think that more and more news is pre-roll or social mobile video, and people are trying to monetize it via pre-roll, which seems like a really stupid idea to have a 30-second commercial in front of a 45-second story. And so I'm looking at these as hard trends, and I on one hand I'm flummoxed because we do need these new models and we do need to monetize because we got to pay for things. At the same time, the interest in news is so high, And consumers are so much more involved than they ever were when they were sitting back and being, told what to think by reporters and journalists. Now it's participatory, and people are really involved and really passionate about the news. And so creating a new model where publishers get paid, or brands fund a story, or brands create content that someone has to, that they pay for. I think these are more likely ways to pay for things than 30-second pre-roll on banners.
Yeah, and I know some of those models aren't entirely new either. I mean, you look at like the Knight Ridder Foundation, right? Where, they're getting grants and subsidies and whatnot that then fund investigative reporting. It's just that you kind of need that middleman, really, to create that separation between the reporters doing the reporting and the brands to create that trust factor. There's some kind of sobering, I was just looking up some stats, and frankly, for my business, I had these as well. In 2007, there were 55,000 full-time journalists. In 2015, 8 years later, there were 33,000. So, 55 down to 33,000 journalists. It's a lot of content producers that are out there. And I find it really interesting, being on the agency side, talk to a lot of brands, talk to a lot of other agencies, and even media agencies that they don't have enough content. They can't find it, they don't know how to create it. And you've got on the other side, 22,000 journalists that are without jobs. And it's it's not rocket science here. There's people that can create this stuff. It's just a matter of finding those connection points for people. Anyways, I want to actually break a little earlier than normal to see, we have some more questions we can tee up, but just wanted to see for you all if you had questions that you wanted to throw out as well. Sorry, I kind of didn't have you guys ready with the mic. Keeping you on your toes, Steve. Hey, I wasn't planning to be a moderator either, so we got to roll with the punches.
Yeah, so one thing that we're obviously always looking at is how do we reach consumers, right? And there are a couple of truths that have surfaced, which kind of casts an interesting light in everything that we're talking about here. One is that the consumer's ability to focus is somewhere around that of a gnat. So you're starting to see the rise of Twitter and where Instagram is going, which is screw the long form content, just go with the photo and a real quick blurb, and that's all a lot of consumers even want anymore. And the scary thing is that, I don't know if you're familiar with Twitter's Moments aspect or whatever, but they'll break news on Twitter before it ever even gets written up and posted on USA Today's online app, right? So the speed to market is completely being reinvented through social and through all these little quick snap vehicles, which really raises the question, I can tell you where the 22,000 jobs went. It's being filled by tens of millions of little tweeters all over the place. The whole concept of content creation has been crowdsourced.
I actually would disagree with that, because I don't think so. Because if you look at that's just breaking news, and if you look at journalism and news as a whole, just like all the verticals that we have with all of our different clients, there's lots of different ones with lots of different things. And so to me, the concerning thing about that 22,000 is, yeah, some of them are covering breaking news and it's being filled by stuff like that, but some of them are also covering the state, and local, not only local politics, but other government, education, or looking into things about just doing more in-depth reporting where it's not just you're writing about something superficially, but you're looking at maybe other experts on it. You're looking at both sides of the story. You're going in depth. And I would also challenge, I think you make good points, so I'm kind of pushing back a little bit for entertainment purpose. But
I actually think that that's a really important thing about real-time news and how we're getting it now, which is much more likely to be somebody with a smartphone who has no news training and they just happen to be in the right place at the right time. They share that either in a live stream or in a video clip, and it goes viral on Twitter. Those type of sources and that kind of information flow needs to be accompanied by a layer of professional verification and vetting. There's a lot of misinformation that travels very quickly through social media, and there's actually interesting companies like Storyful and groups like that that are really trying to get their hands around how do we. There's a thing called First Draft News, which is sponsored by Google News Project as well, and that's going to be a really important layer that we need to build. And it feels to me that crowdsourcing isn't going to get us the whole way. That there's going to have to be some kind of level of professional vetting and some best practices that we evolve as platform providers. So for one example, Medium has become a very popular spot for all of the candidates in the 2016 election to post original articles, essays, trying to reach their constituents. And so we saw this trend happening. Hillary Clinton, Mitt Romney, all these guys were like using Medium, and some of their posts were going viral. And they're now owning the relationship with the audience. There's nobody to vet that stuff. They can say what they like. So we actually did a relationship with Knight Foundation, which gave us a grant that brought in PolitiFact, which is a national, very well-respected, nonpartisan fact-checking organization. And they're now fact-checking Medium posts from politicians that are related to the 2016 election cycle. So this is a beginning of trying to think through how do we create the kinds of traditional media checks and balances, verification that is, sources go direct now. So that the traditional role of media is where media is being disintermediated, and we get direct feeds. So how do we rebuild some kind of layers of trust? And this may be on the platform level, it may be some coordination with professional news organizations or something that we haven't imagined yet.
I also think it's interesting, the long form piece as well, because I was kind of looking at that and challenging my own business model, right? And looking at Netflix and looking at like the top movies from 2015, and a lot of the top movies in 2015 are epically long movies, right? And you look at Netflix and Amazon where they're releasing the whole season at once and people are binge watching it. And a lot of those shows are richly layered shows, like House of Cards or like Daredevil and things like that. I think that there's definitely a large market and audience. I don't disagree that the majority of attention span, the majority of the time is that size, but I think there's still a marketplace out there for good, layered, in-depth content if it's presented in the right place at the right time with the right focus. And because this stuff, I think the Fourth Estate stuff, this isn't a quantity play, it's a quality play. And how do we find the avenues and the models to make sure there's that variety of quality out there to fulfill that role? That's kind of my standpoint on it, at least.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, Brian, to your point, this is directed to Evan. So kudos. I've been reading Medium for a while. You brought, long-form content and really in-depth and intellectually engaging reporting back. So I love it. Given your announcement yesterday, though, about opening up the platform, how can you sort of, I don't want to say police or prevent, but how can you help guide those new publishers from devolving into these, quantity over quality and these salacious headlines that are clickbait and these, these ridiculous, these listicles that you see everywhere? How do we avoid getting back to that?
That's a great question. So we're experimenting with some new metrics that try to reward engagement and depth over throwaway, clickbait, and kind of fluff. And so in our paid, our revenue kind of program, we pay our partners by a metric we call total time reading. It's a proprietary metric that we have created on Medium where we track cursor movement and time on screen, and we try to assess whether someone is actively consuming content on a page, and we aggregate all of the time across everyone who's looking at a particular piece of content. We give you an overall total time reading score in number of hours. I think we have like over 10,000 years of reading on Medium at this point. So we're focusing on trying to find signals that are actually showing true engagement with content as opposed to, very, quick. I looked at that, it was actually not what I wanted, and I bounced, but you still get the ad impression, you still get the incentive to build that kind of content in a traditional kind of ad-supported model. So for us, we're really trying to shift attention away from clicks and page views and focus on deeper, more meaningful metrics of engagement, and communicate that to our audience or to our publishers. The second thing is, we think we spend a lot of time trying to model the kinds of content that we want people to bring to Medium. So for the first period of time, it was invite only. We actively brought in people to bring in longer form, more well-crafted stories. We actually ran into an interesting issue with that. We were so successful at that we started getting a lot of feedback from people who wanted to use Medium, but they were scared. They said, I don't think I have anything good enough to contribute. So we had to make it feel a little bit more accessible and relatable to the average person. We didn't want to make it like, if you're not writing for a Pulitzer, you shouldn't write for Medium. So the other method that we use is just trying to create a really smart filter that is going to surface and promote and amplify the stories that are the best suited to a particular reader. So we don't want to become like a particular tastemaker and present one point of view. We actually think there's many different definitions of excellence, and one person's excellence is another person's trash. So we want to try to figure out what are the interest graph of you, the reader, and how can we then connect you with as many articles that we think have a statistically superior chance of resonating with you.
I think that there's a misconception that, okay, there's a certain kind of person that only consumes political content. I think people are multivariate, right? And I think that you could be interested in politics and policy, but also be interested in cute puppies and babies. And I think that was one of the geniuses of the Huffington Post, was that it's unapologetically highbrow and lowbrow, and it's appealing to the same person. I think where companies get into trouble and where companies try to emulate like a HuffPost or a BuzzFeed is by using clickbait. And I think in a weird way, the way that Facebook algorithm works, it actually punishes disingenuous publishers that use clickbait. Because the way the Facebook algorithm works is if someone clicks on a story and then bails and doesn't read and doesn't share, it's penalized, right? Because you overpromise and you didn't deliver. And what it does reward is if you give a interesting headline and it's actually the 29 chips that will blow your mind. And people always ask me, why, what's with the numbers? And you said there's 17 ways to awesomely enjoy chips. No, it's 29 because BuzzFeed said so, right? But you can't fake it. Like if it's only 27, people are going to say, oh, this sucks, and they're not going to share it. They're not going to read it. And so Facebook rewards engagement and rewards sharing. And so you get a lot of these new publishers that try to take shortcuts or do tricks to try to get user engagement, and they ended up getting penalized 2 or 3 months later.
But how do you successfully monetize this hyper distribution mechanism that social has now made possible? Not only personal distribution through tweeting and retweeting, but also this hyperactive social platform that is just not only driving content everywhere, but also has a tendency sort of to diffuse the brand, so that this stuff gets passed around, but to a degree where it's not really being attributed to a source anymore.
Yeah, I get it, and it's hard. And back in the olden days, which was maybe 2 years ago, you would hope for a viral story and people would click on it and they'd go to your website, and once they're on a web page, you can monetize with a banner. But consumers are completely and totally in charge. And content, they want to consume it wherever they are, whenever they want, usually on a smart device. They want social mobile video, and they don't want to be jumping around and waiting for you to go from site to site. And so how you monetize it is a big to be determined. It has to be monetized, it has to be done, and I think that Facebook and sort of new innovative news publishers are trying to figure that out right now. And I know that it's not banners on cell phones. I know that it's not 30-second pre-roll. in front of a video. I think that the platform partners like Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram need this content. They need people like the Medium and San Francisco Chronicle to make money on this stuff. Because if not, then where are they going to get their content? They're not in the content business. But coming up with a delightful ad product that consumers will enjoy, I think that's the challenge.
I think the conversation sometimes should maybe be switched to not how you advertise on these stories or how do you monetize these stories, but maybe asking the question, how do you subsidize these stories? Because I think when you look at newspapers historically, the news section, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the news section was more or less subsidized by classified ads and by display ads in the sports section.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. So then as like,
Classified.
yeah, so, and then as Craigslist, took all the classified business out of the industry, that resulted in cuts, not in the classified section, well, yeah, in the classified section, but across the whole newsroom. So, from going back, way to the beginning of Hearst, things were subsidized throughout the newspaper in a way that's, I think, how we have to look at it. Like, it's gonna always be incredibly hard to monetize this type of news or this type of reporting, but there's other options. You've got these brands that need content and need to position themselves as leaders in the marketplace. There's an interesting, the Guardian did something with Amazon. Amazon sponsored I got my notes here, a 4-part series on an unsolved murder in LA. And so, why would Amazon do something like that? Because they were doing it to promote the second season of, I don't know how you pronounce it, Bosch? I don't watch the show, Bosch. But they did this thing where they funded a pretty in-depth investigative report on an unsolved murder in order to help promote their television show. And I think those are the types of ways that we can find unique ways to basically subsidize this type of research and content creation.
Well, I would also say, just as an intrinsic value of investigative journalism, it's the best marketing you can do as a news organization. Who'd heard of Süddeutschland Zeitung up until Sunday, right? Everybody's going to remember. Anybody who cares about news is going to remember Süddeutschland Zeitung for a really long time. That's the newspaper, the German newspaper that first received the cache of documents from the Panama Papers. At Wired, we definitely had a subsidy model in the sense that certain aspects of our news gathering were highly commercial, gadget reviews, things like that. We could make a ton of money on it. And at the same time, I did not want that brand, the brand of Wired, to become known as sort of like Engadget. I thought that the brand deserved to have a higher aspiration, and so we put a lot of effort into investigative reporting for the sake of the brand. That by breaking big stories, we influenced what people thought about Wired as an influential place for thinking about what's coming with technology. And that brand positioning has huge value when you then go to advertisers who want the halo effect of that. And you can see brands like Huffington Post getting very serious about investigative reporting. There's an amazing team of reporters that are working on that kind of stuff. And they're not doing it, it's expensive, yes, but I think they're doing it because of the brand lift that is going to come from that. BuzzFeed is in the same boat, where they're trying to convince themselves or convince readers that they're a serious place for news, that this is not just entertainment and lolcats, but it's actually they're a source of legitimate, serious news gathering. Ben Smith is a very serious news guy. But getting that across to the public you can do all the advertising you want, you can do all the marketing you want. At the end of the day, you got to walk the walk, and that means you have to deliver really important, socially relevant news that would not have been reported except for the efforts of your news team. It's like somebody once said, there's marketing, and which is there's real news, which is something somebody somewhere does not want you to know about, and everything else is marketing.
But that sort of both brings together, Evan, what you just said sort of ties back together to Brian's points. We're going to start seeing this stuff funded from maybe unanticipated and unexpected places. Like, for instance, one of the things that I'm seeing among a lot of the millennially focused content companies is they'll start in an area like maybe gadgets or especially fashion and style and celebrity, and then start finding that their audience has a tremendous taste for news. And they start growing news organizations out of that, and to some degree the way BuzzFeed did. So we start seeing sort of legitimate and trustworthy news outlets start growing out of other content areas we didn't expect, because we're talking to a different type of news consumer now.
Yeah, and I would say the corollary of that is serious, important news brands need to understand that including entertainment in your mix is really important to being a successful brand on the internet. We don't distinguish anymore. So for people who start with sort of a more entertainment bent focus, they have going to service sort of the guilty pleasure kind of stuff. Quickly find, hey, we need to balance that with some serious dose of news. Similarly, I think a lot of these very earnest, serious news organizations would do a lot better if they realize that animated GIFs are hilarious and they should use them.
I love how the New York Times sometimes does some entertainment story. They do a process story about the other people reporting on the entertainment story. Then they get Justin Bieber onto the front page. So I always find that fascinating the way they do. They will not just do a story about Justin Bieber, but they will talk about other people doing a story about Justin Bieber.
But think about New York Times weddings and real estate and travel. I mean, it's high-class fluff, right? It's not serious news journalism, but I think readers are interested in everything.
And what's totally fascinating to me, and I'm not saying that I'm not just advocating for what I'm trying to do, but what's fascinating to me is this challenge we're talking about for publishers and that mix of content and the halo effect of doing the investigative reporting. It's the exact same problem all the brands have. It's like for so many of the brands, it's the exact same problem. And it's like, and we're all tackling this separately, instead of looking at ways of coming together on it. And that, to me, it's just like, it's so interesting how parallel the challenges are in reaching an audience between the brands and the publishers, and yet it's like the two sides just can't speak the same language, and so they're just sitting there battling their heads against the wall that if they just peek over, they could maybe solve it together.
But brands don't like risk. So imagine you're
Right.
the brand sponsor for your Citibank, and you're sponsoring the Wall Street Journal, and then they decide to do a series of exposés on Citibank's role in the banking crisis. I mean, as a news organization, you don't want your hands tied. You need to follow where the story goes, and you need to follow the things that are most socially relevant, what's going to have the most
Agreed.
impact. And as a brand, you really don't want that risk. You don't want to have any kind of touch on anything that's going to potentially.
Yeah, but
come
look
back.
at a brand like Goldie Blocks, right? That does engineering toys for girls. They could fund a 6-part series on gender equality in the workplace and within education. And I don't think it's an end-all be-all thing, but it's amazing to me how big a problem this is, and that there's not more collaboration going on to solve
Right.
it.
Well, I think you could cherry pick sort of socially safe topics that you're going to align with as a brand, but I don't think that gives you coverage on the things that news reporters need to cover.
Well, but I don't know if it's socially safe, though, because gender equality is a highly volatile subject, but for certain brands, it resonates with their audience in a way that doesn't impact their bottom line, and so it's actually safe for that brand, even though it's a highly volatile subject. So,
Are brands more or less risk averse now? I mean, are they more scared they're going to get paired up with the wrong type of story or the wrong content or the wrong media vehicle, or less than in the past?
I was at a conference. I'm looking at these Coke bottles here, and I was talking to the social media manager for Coke, and she has several hundred Coke-approved images that the company is asking for her to go viral, and they're all people, with Cokes like this, right? But they're pre-approved by the company, and none of them will go viral. None of them will be shared. They're all they smell like corporate Coke. And she has millions of real, organic, honest people with Cokes that are sharing this stuff, and the company does not allow her to share what consumers are providing her. And to me, that's an example of a company that is not letting go, and brand is really important to them. But at a certain stage, consumers own the brand, and so why don't you just let them run with it? And I still think that you're right. I think brands are risk averse, and they want to control everything, even though they know that consumers are completely and totally in charge now.
Yeah, that explains why Reddit can't make a nickel on advertising. I mean, huge site. Probably it commands more attention than like any major media property, like New York Times, you name it. But advertisers won't touch it. It's too risky.
We have to wrap there. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Great conversation. Really appreciate it. By the way, we are doing our own publishing summit in Key Largo at the beginning of May 1st through 4th, and some of these very questions we're going to be engaging there in one of our 3-day retreats. We're going to take about 10 minutes to have some coffee. When we come back, we're going to finish off the afternoon by sort of pushing some of these principles even further. We're going to have Alan come back with a panel to discuss what an opt-in ad economy would look like. So grab some coffee, and we'll start up in about 10 minutes.